everyone. My name is Ashley Hancock, and I am a speech-language pathologist. I see some familiar faces in the room, so thanks for supporting me. My presentation today is on in-home communication supports and strategies for Gestalt language processors. Has anyone, raise your hand if you've heard of the term Gestalt language processing. Awesome. Does anyone have a kid in the room that has a GLP? Okay, great. So I'm excited to provide some more supports and information and hopefully kind of have an open discussion too on what you see with your child, what you see in their speech therapy, and some different things that you guys can do at home. To just give you a little bit of information on my background and my history, I'm actually from Illinois. I moved down here about 3 years ago, and I've been working at ACT Therapy Services for about 2.5, 3 years now. I've taken quite a few courses, particularly on Gestalt language processing, AAC, and overall neurodiversity affirming therapy. Those are kind of my niches and my specialties in the area. So I have quite a bit of information from many different sources. So the purpose of this conversation is to help you get a better understanding of Gestalt language development, understand how Gestalts and each of the stages may present in your child, and learn strategies of what you can do better at home to support that language development. Okay, so just to give you overall reaching information about Gestalt language processing, essentially it is echolalia. And so echolalia is the repetition of words, phrases, or sounds that they have heard before in their environment. So that can look like immediate echolalia or delayed echolalia. And the difference between the two, it just depends on the time between it, right? So if I say something and you say it right back in the same exact way, that would be immediate echolalia. Whereas if there's a pause, even a few minutes, then it's delayed echolalia. And that can go, minutes, hours, days, years even. So echolalia, essentially the premise of Gestalt language processing is that it is very meaningful. So that it has many different ways to communicate. And so this is just a few of the meaning behind echolalia. And then also there's a few there, as you can see, very communicative, but there's also just for self-regulation, right, or to engage in play. So it may not necessarily be directed towards the communication partner, even though it can be. It may be for themselves more and to keep themselves regulated. So there's Gestalt language processing and analytical language processing. So those are kind of the two ways to develop language. When you hear analytical language processing, think of probably how you know language development in milestones, right? Single words, building off of that, being able to combine words to sentences, the typical language approach taken in speech therapy or as your child is learning. So Gestalt language processing is a top-down approach in comparison to ALP. So some examples of echolalia that we use, or phrases that are very common, are like, ready, set, go, give me 5, how are you? So it's important that echolalia is acknowledged, and it's not something to fear or be frustrated with, and it can be a wonderful part of language development. So some examples of when we have Gestalt language development, it requires different supports, right, because it's a different way to process language. So, for example, some strategies that may be early introduced to you in early intervention may be like close statements, right, ready, set, you fill in the blank, go, different things like that for analytical language development, those are often utilized right early on, where for Gestalt language development, they may not be the most appropriate, or you may see them be more prompt dependent on you, especially if they're in stage 1, and so we'll talk more about that. Okay. So this is just a comparison side by side of analytical versus Gestalt. And so it shows you step by step of the stages, what that can look differently. So actually when you look at stage 4, and I'm going to just take a quick glance at this, the next focuses on the NLA stages. When you look at stage 3, that's actually where analytical language processors start. They start with those single words and having a single unit of meaning. So that's what I mean by top-down. They kind of have an opposite approach, whereas later on in stage 3, that's where analytical language processors would start. So today I'm going to focus more on stage 1 and stage 2 because typically on the journey that's kind of where it starts, although that may not be where your child is at. And I'll touch on stages 3 through 6 as well. So characteristics and what this can look like for a GLP. They may be using long scripts. Now, scripts are echolalia or gestalts, kind of some similar names for all the same thing. Scripts, you've probably been more familiar with scripting. That also includes unintelligible strings of language. Those are gestalts. So that may look like they're kind of going really fast and not keeping up with what that gestalt is. Or they're getting to a specific part. So you may hear da-da-da-da-da-da, and then you hear a certain part of that is intelligible because whatever came before that, they're trying to get to the part that's important. Or their articulation skills can't keep up with how fast their brain is going through that gestalt. Rich intonation. They really like that prosody. So that's oftentimes how gestalts are picked up, through that strong emotion. So oftentimes when somebody falls on maybe their show or something really big happens, or whether that's scary or exciting or frustrating, right, they're more likely to pick up on that language that's really rich in intonation. They may have a lot of single words and have a hard time combining them and getting to that next level of analytical language processing. So when they're given traditional language strategies, right, of you start in early intervention labeling things, right, talking about verbs, and then you move to putting two words together, there may be some more difficulty in that next step when they're given those traditional language approaches. And taught language, so structured settings, right, like school, or if we're using sentence strips that are like, I want blank, that may not be as supportive. It may not support their language development, the natural use of that. Or they can use certain language in a specific context, but it's hard for that, or it's harder for them, or you don't see them use it anywhere else. They only use it when you're playing this specific activity in that specific room, and then it's harder for them to generalize that, especially if they're not given those NLA strategy supports. Does anyone have any questions about this? Have you seen any other characteristics with your child, or have anyone want to add anything?
My son does both.
Yeah.
And I've heard of, is it dual language?
Yes.
When you have them like split, I'm like, both.
Yeah.
So, is there one I should lean more towards? That's been like really hard. Is like how to approach language.
Yeah, absolutely.
Knowing you learn both.
Yeah, totally. So there are strategies, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, especially when you're looking at early on, right? When you are like, ooh, my child might be a GLP, but they're like 2, 3, so it's kind of hard to tell because echolalia does come throughout analytical language development, right? Because they'll repeat you, so that can fit in both categories at such an early age. So there are strategies that work for both. So what I would recommend is, and we'll talk about this, those strategies that work for both, that support general language development without getting them stuck on some of the like closed phrases or different things like that maybe support more analytical language processors, but they're strategies that definitely support both language development that are very helpful for dual language processors too. I'm glad you brought that up. That's another area, right? Okay, so defining a gestalt. It can be picked up really from anywhere. A lot of times I will see from favorite shows, books. Like it says here, it can be an entire book. I've seen that as well. Things that you guys often say at home with your children, things they maybe hear often with their siblings. It could be from anywhere. So it's an intonationally defined unit of language. So when they pick up that gestalt, it has one unit of meaning. So that entire gestalt or script has one unit of meaning to them. And that can be non-literal as well. So for example, what they're saying may not mean exactly what you're hearing. And it may take some investigative work, and we're going to talk about that, to figure out what that means when they're using it and why they're using it. And so meaning is tied to that meaningful experience, and that's really how gestalts are acquired, because it's meaningful to them. So that's kind of the whole premise, too, about supporting the language. It needs to be meaningful to them. We could be modeling general phrases that we have been told may fit, but if it doesn't work for the child and it's not meaningful to them, then that also, too, may not best support their language. And it may be acquired during a highly emotional time. So there may be some scripts with swearing that you may hear, because that has high emotion and strong feeling to it, right? That is not uncommon. So a little funny thing, like when little children cuss, in the same way that way. And it can be anywhere in length, so it can be a single word, gestalt as well. And it's just figuring out, for example, some of my kids may call every wild animal a dinosaur, right? That is a gestalt because it has a very broad meaning, and it means every wild animal is a dinosaur. Some examples of where it can be hard in this investigation and figuring out where the gestalt is. It can be hard to understand what they're saying, especially if it's a really long string of language. So it can be hard, and it may take some time to figure out, wow, I still can't figure out what they're saying, right? Recognizing where it's from, because our kids, they watch so many different things, and it can be from so many different places or from all over, especially if they're older. So that may take some, watching them watch TV, right? And being like, oh, I recognize that intonation, or that character would be likely to say something like that. Or even just identifying that it is a gestalt. I've had some kids come in with so many different gestalts that sound like it could be them, and then I hear them say the same things in the next session, and then the next session, and I'm like, oh, I totally thought that maybe they were telling me something they were thinking of, but because I could recognize the patterns or the way that they said it in that certain context, it's a gestalt to them. Does anyone want to share any interesting gestalts that they have came across with their kids? Go ahead.
So my son was watching anime with his dad one day, and now he uses the phrase WTH. And it's just random, we were watching Bluey, and he's WTH. I told him to get his lunchbox. WTH. What are you saying?
Oh, that is too funny.
Use it at school yet?
Yes. Oh, that is too funny.
My son's 5, and just recently got diagnosed within the last month. But we think this came from my father-in-law. But one day I asked my son to do something. He goes, "Okay, boss." I just laughed so hard. I was like,
Yep.
That's hilarious. But
Yes.
then I think, my father-in-law said that to him because he was like, we're going to do this and that. But then, for months, anytime anybody asked him to do anything, "Okay, boss."
Oh, that's great.
And my 3-year-old started doing it, and I was like, oh my God.
I love when it's a little sarcastic or sassy, because you're like, okay, wow, you're really catching on that personality of that person. It's so funny because a lot of the kids I work with, their parents can tell when it's me, they're using me. Some of my kids are in stage 4, stage 5 now, but they love watching old videos that I've sent to their parents of me working with them. So they'll start scripting me in their session of what I did in that one time when I did trains, and so they'll look at me to be myself in a video I took 2 years ago, expecting me to know exactly what to say. And I'll look at them like, I know you're trying to, I know where this is going, and I have no idea what I said 2 years ago at that time. So it's so funny what can be so meaningful to them, right? Anyone else? Yeah, go ahead.
So I get text messages from my son's teacher weekly about something funny that he
Yeah.
said, and it's always from either a video or whatever, but she wanted him to come sit and do a worksheet with him, and he said, "What the heck is this garbage?" And a lot of the times when somebody's asked to do something, he'll go, "Seriously?" And it's something
Yes,
he's watched,
yeah.
and he uses it appropriately.
Oh, it's so funny. And to people who maybe not know that it's from somewhere, they're like, wow, you gotta,
I know. Or
wow, all right. But because they pick up right on the intonation and that emotion into that, right? And so they're using that the same way, which I mean, they're protesting very, very much in their own way. I love it. That's great. Go ahead.
Our son's 2.5, and he can repeat a book from beginning to end, or a song from beginning to end, or an episode from Miss Rachel from beginning to end.
Yep.
He's heard, and he performs it in front of a mirror because he stares at himself.
Yeah.
And if you're not paying attention to him, he's just standing in front of a mirror, just going, singing
Yeah.
a song or a book, and before bed, he's got the same books over and over. He's got it,
Yeah.
and he's like, one more time?
Uh-huh.
And I'm like, no. You already said that like 5 times. So
Yeah. Oh, that's so cool. And he's 2.5. What a cool skill to have. That is so awesome. And that kind of goes into Gestalt cognitive processing. So the way that they can develop language, that's their cognitive thinking too. So when we think whole, right? If something's missing from that whole piece, or we can't complete that Gestalt, whether that looks like in play, a puzzle, a book, it can be dysregulating or frustrating.
You skip a page.
You're like, all right, we got to get to bedtime. It can't happen that
He
way.
gets very upset if you accidentally skip a page because most of the books I know by heart too, because I've been saying it for so long.
Probably longer before he did, yeah.
If I skip a page or something, he looks at me, he's like, oh!
Yep.
What? I'm like, oh crap, sorry.
Yes.
I don't remember that word. I don't know. You know it.
Right. Can you fill me in? Can you? Yeah.
I know what it is.
Oh, that is too funny. Yeah, go ahead.
So my son, whenever I ask him like to, we need to go take a shower or this, that, he goes, oh, come down. That's from one of the movies. My thing will be like a lot of the time we think it's funny and we kind of like,
Yep.
okay, that's appropriate. A lot
Yes.
of the time we can connect
Mhm.
exactly what they mean.
Yes.
Some just stole or just, we don't know where they come from.
Right.
What can we do about that? Like, what would be the step to understanding or encouraging them to keep using them? Or
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you might be going closely into my next slide. So what we can do there is, it's so important to acknowledge, right, and seek understanding. So one, what I like to do with a lot of my GLPs that are in stage 4, like, what is that from? Now, if you ask anyone in stage 1 or 2, they're going to look at you like you're crazy. Like, they're not going to tell you exactly where it's from and where they heard it, right? Or they may just ignore you. But acknowledging that and repeating it back to them, whatever you can pick up from it, will be the best way that you can respond and be a good communication partner. So repeating that Gestalt back to them. Or a lot of my kids, it may be like a back and forth, right? They're saying one thing, so you say the next. So if you know the next line, which also, like you said, and if you have no idea where it's from, if you have a suspicion, when you have a minute, going and looking like, okay, where is that from again? Or there are, and anyone who wants this website can chat with me after, there are certain websites where you can type in, now it searches the whole World Wide Web, so like we're talking hundreds of years of movies, right? But you can type in a line and it may tell you where it's from, or pick up certain places. So if you suspect it may be from Cars 2 and you can type in Cars 2 in a part of a line, you're more likely to get something, whereas if you just have a line and you have no idea where it's from, it may be a little bit out there and give you like still hundreds of videos. But investigating, figuring out where that's from, and oftentimes when you get to watch the clip, you may also know what it means, right? Because that tells you the non-literal context, or that context that they said it. So then you can pick up on what they're trying to tell you and model something that fits what they're trying to say there. Does that make sense? And I've got some more tips coming up in a couple too of how you can acknowledge and connect with them in those instances. Yes?
Taking hers one step further. So if he said, calm down, can you give an example of what should be the response?
Yes, can you tell me the context again when he said calm down?
So whenever like I tell him like, oh, it's time to clean up or it's time to go take a bath, he will, oh, calm down. And that's from Toy Story. I believe
Yes.
it's Mr.
Yeah.
Potato Head. And it's kind of one of those things like, don't tell me what to do.
Yes.
And I normally just go like, oh, just remember to take a bath. I make it
Yes.
silly and he kind of like,
Yeah.
but that's one that I get.
Yes.
Sometimes he tells me other ones and I'm
Mhm.
like, ooh, I have to be like, where is this from?
Right.
Why do you use
Yeah.
this?
So there, I would respond with, and so this is where we want to model what the kid would say, right? So even though you can't not give him a bath tonight because he still needs to take a bath, saying something like, don't tell me what to do, I don't want to do that. And trying to really get that strong intonation and emotional meaning to that. and model that and see how he responds if he repeats it. Ooh, you may have a great model where he can then hopefully say that next time. He may still say calm down, but then he may follow that up with, I don't want to do that. I'm not ready for it. I need more time. So modeling something like that. Now, the first one that you say may not be the first one that connects. You may need to try, dig a little bit deeper, right? I want to play more. That may be the one that sticks, right? But once that sticks, you know, okay, when he's saying calm down, he's meaning like, ooh, this is making me upset, or, that upsets me. And then you can go off of that and model that and help with that stage 1 development of giving him more gestalts for what he's trying to tell you in that instance. But the first thing you can do is just acknowledge that, and always acknowledge that, and then model what you think they're trying to tell you. And then if you can give them 5 more minutes, that's ideal, right? Because then they feel really powerful in using that language. You heard them, they feel understood, they're more likely to tell you what they're feeling next time when they do get to play more. That doesn't mean no bath, but they get some extra time. Yeah?
Just a quick add. So
Yeah.
would you say, because my son, if I know he's meaning something else,
Yeah.
and I want to kind of give him a script to replace that.
Yes.
But if I just try to replace the script right away, he gets really frustrated because he thinks I didn't hear him.
Right.
So it's important, I just want to make clarity that, like, it's important so for that, like, say, oh, calm down. I don't want to take it back.
Yes,
Or,
exactly.
So, like, say what they said.
Yes.
Repeat what they said so they know you heard them and you
Yes.
understand that they're trying to say something. And then get the script.
Yes, exactly. Spot on. So acknowledging and repeating that back is going to be the best thing that you can do always, because then they feel heard. You're very right.
So you should say, I am calm.
Right. Right, exactly, yes. Oh, it's so funny. Did anyone have anything else? I think this is a great conversation. There are just hundreds of gestalts out there. Go ahead.
I work with someone who's certified in GLP for my son also.
Yeah.
I've noticed in the couple months that we've worked with her, when I give my son language to model, even if I'm done just talking to him later in the day, he'll repeat back what I said, often rather than coming up with an answer where I know he can answer my question, but he's so used to then repeating what I say. So I know you're not supposed to say this, but would it be helpful if I said you could say I'm not ready, so that in later times, like he knows when I'm asking him a question, I'm not looking for you to just repeat back the response, because then I'd say, do you want chips or veggie straws? He says, I want veggie straws. When I bring him veggie straws,
Yeah.
I'm like, no, I wanted chips.
Yeah.
And he was just repeating back what I said, because
Yeah.
she's so used to me modeling language for him that he's expected to repeat in that moment.
Yeah.
I don't know how you get around that.
That's very interesting. It kind of depends on what stage he's in, too. So we can chat a little bit more in depth about that, but depending on what stage he is in, and if he's more in stage 1, it may be better to offer up more models that aren't questions. And we can talk about what that kind of looks like, because it is hard. Oh, stage 4. Okay, got it, gotcha. So cool. So he is just kind of relying on you, it kind of sounds like, or using your language a little bit more often. That's very interesting. We can chat a little bit more about that. I need to spin my wheels on that a little bit. Okay, so overall important points before I get into supports and strategies. So GLP is a natural process. It is not disordered. So oftentimes when, I'm doing an eval, I will say, they present with an expressive receptive language delay, but GLP is a valid way of processing language. It's not, GLP does not equal disordered. There are actually a lot of kids out there who are GLPs, but we maybe didn't know it because they process through all the stages so quickly by the time they were 3, and then they present it as an analytical language processor. So just want to always put that out there. Just because they are a GLP doesn't mean that equals disordered language. It's just a different way to develop language. So the goal when you're working with a GLP or your child is to meet them at their current stage and to help them naturally progress to the next stage when they're ready. So when they're showing signs of progressing to that next stage or starting to get more stage 2, that's when we would start modeling stage 2 or the next stage. So for example, age does not equal stage for a GLP. So I still work with Gestalt language processors who may be 8 or 9, and they are in stage 1, which at that point, right, structured academics and even speech therapy, can be more the typical model. But because they're in stage 1 or stage 2, they're more likely to just memorize that language. So they may be able to answer questions, but it's not their own language. They're just repeating what you're saying. So it's not necessarily meaningful to them. So that's why it's really important when they're in stage 3 and thoroughly in 50% at least in stage 3, that's when they can recognize single words as meaningful units. So it's just important to keep that in mind. That doesn't mean that, everything has to be child-led, especially if your child is older, because that's not practical, right? But it's important to know what's going to best support your child's language and what teachers, speech therapists, everybody on their team can do better to support their language and naturally progressing through those stages. And so the primary purpose of language supports through the natural language acquisition is to model language of that expectation. And so just like she said, trying to avoid say, right? Because one, they're just going to say, they're going to say, more likely. And it has to be meaningful for them to actually, for it to be a true gestalt and for it to naturally move through the stages. So that's why modeling with that expectation is so important. And overall, when you're getting more of this information and trying to figure out what works best for your kid and advocating for them, you know better, you do better, right? So it's never too late to help your team change that approach and figure out what works for your kid. And that needs to be individualized, right? It doesn't mean that everything I say today is going to work for your kid. It's looking at, okay, what are they doing? How are they responding to it? How can I change what I'm doing to better support their language development? Okay, so just making the shift to neurodiversity affirming lens and what that looks like. This is something I'm pretty passionate about and not what the topic is on today, but as you can see, a lot of the principles of the natural language acquisition are important for neurodiversity affirming. So a strength-based approach, child-led language, recognizing and respecting their differences, right? Whether that's sensory, communication, their differences are valid. And listening to autistic adults and their experiences. And has anyone ever heard of the double empathy problem? Okay. So double empathy problem is a theory created by an autistic researcher, Damian Milton, in 2012. And so really what it means is that two different neurotypes communicating, that there is a mutual challenge in communication understanding. So think of it like speaking the same brain language. People who have similar brain types, so neurodivergent, neurotypical, usually get each other more easily. But if their brain types are different, they may need to work harder to understand each other. So essentially what that says is neurodivergent communication styles are valid, and we shouldn't try to change that. So for example, what that may look like is info dumping, right? A lot of my clients love to talk about the same topic and tell you a lot about it because they're very passionate about it, and that's a valid way to communicate, right? So your goal is to give them the self-advocacy skills to advocate for themselves in environments and how they communicate, right? So if people aren't understanding or they're getting bored, giving them the skills to be able to communicate through those situations rather than telling them it's not okay to talk about the same topic on and on. Or eye contact, right? For neurodivergent individuals, that can look different. And so we don't want to force eye contact because that is a communication difference versus something to work on like social skills. Does that make sense? So I just wanted to overreaching. And the biggest part of that I see with my GLPs is joint attention, right? So your child may be listening even though they're 5 feet away and they're looking at something else. They could easily be paying attention to every word that you're saying. So it's advocating for them in the classroom, right? What does their sensory needs look like? And that like, hey, they're still attending even though they're not looking at you, quiet hands, making eye contact. This is how they typically show that they're paying attention to me. So whether that's like a glance or they're in the same space but not necessarily next to peers, what does that look like for your child? And how can you support that so then it's not forcing eye contact or, quiet hands or different things like that. Any questions about this? Okay, awesome. Okay, So this is kind of what we talked about, those first steps in Gestalt language processing and responding to scripts and Gestalts. So acknowledging and affirming, repeating that back to them. And if you can't understand what they're saying, which happens to me about 50% of the time, it's repeating, yeah, and just showing a positive body language to them. And then a lot of my kids will continue to repeat it, and I try my best to figure out what they're trying to say. So acknowledging that communication and responding, or just continuing that interaction so they feel heard and acknowledged. Looking at all forms of communication, because Gestalts aren't always verbal and completely understandable. A lot of my kids will loop on YouTube, especially if they're mainly speaking or non-speaking. They will go to a specific video and they will play the certain seconds over and over again, which I find really cool. So it's acknowledging that, like, oh, that's communication. That means something. And even my speaking GLPs will do this too. So acknowledging that and trying to figure out, like, oh, what does that mean? Or what's going on in that video? Or recognizing that as communication. Acting out a Gestalt. A lot of my kids, when they're playing, they'll see something, and then I just see them go into Gestalt mode of, like, oh, that reminds me of this, and they'll go through that, and I'll join them. Singing, and then overall non-literal meanings like we talked about. Now, that doesn't mean for every kid it's non-literal, but I do see a lot of the times, and I try to put myself in somebody who doesn't know GLP, doesn't know the child. Would they take it as the message itself? Because for us, it may not feel non-literal because we know, like, oh, that means that. But would somebody else understand what that means? And trying to kind of get curious at that time. And then, like we said, modeling what you think they mean or know based off of your knowledge on that. So, like we said, calm down means, that makes me mad. I don't want to go now. Different things like that. So trying to figure out what phrase. So a Gestalt doesn't become a Gestalt until it's meaningful for the child. So when we're modeling language like that, we're modeling suggested phrases to them until they pick up on it or have an emotional connection to it. And then continuing this process. So there can be a lot of Gestalts. So trying to keep track of them, whether that's in your notes app, whether that's in a shared Google Doc with your child's team. Keeping track of them because, like we said, affirming and acknowledging that Gestalt echolalia can go so far in creating a relationship with your child. So if their teacher or somebody doesn't understand that they're trying to communicate and they may be ignoring, not intentionally, but they may be ignoring it or not understanding its communication, it can go so far to just tell them, like, hey, these are some of the Gestalts they may use. It would be great if you repeated it back to them, and this is what it might mean. And what that can look like is for example, when you model something that their Gestalt possibly means, bingo, eye contact. They kind of look at you like, oh, wow, that you get me, right? Changes in body language. They may shift or they may get closer to you or show a more positive response. Repeating your message, and that's kind of the big thing that we want because we want them to be able to then use that phrase, whether it becomes a Gestalt, later on to develop through stage 1 and get more Gestalts. Okay. So foundational supports for GLP. I'm going to kind of glaze over this because I've kind of touched on it. But the biggest thing I want to touch on is sensory supports and preferences. I find it so beneficial in collaborating with my OTs and better understanding my kids to know what their body needs and what that looks like for them, right? How they're telling me what their body needs, what Gestalts they may be using, or if they can't communicate, like, hey, I need a break, even if we're just playing. I need a break right now. I really need to jump, or I need to roll, or I need you to squish me on a pillow. So better understanding how they seek sensory supports to get regulated because when they're in the most regulated state, that's when they can communicate the best. Foundational connection and trust. When the child trusts you and connects with you, that's when they're more likely to pick up your language models. And accepting all modalities of communication, right? So especially when they're in stage 1 and if they're still, hand leading you or bringing you things, it's really important to accept that communication and model something for them rather than telling them to use their words or say something, right? Acknowledging that communication and modeling something without the expectation that they'll repeat it. It's great if they repeat it, but troubleshooting, okay, what can I model here? What worked last time? What may they exactly be trying to communicate? Okay, so strategies that you can implement at home. So when you're selecting language models using declarative language, so that looks like making statements, bringing attention to an idea, and without requiring a verbal response from them. So declarative versus imperatives. So telling them something to do would be like share with your sister, asking them a question, are you hungry, what do you want for lunch? Versus declarative and rewording that would be, I wonder what we could have for lunch. I bet your sister would love to have a turn, or I see your backpack on the floor. And the greatest part about things like I see your backpack on the floor is it helps them with their independence and their executive functioning. So rather than telling them exactly what to do and they need to put their backpack away, making an observation and waiting can increase their skills for like recognizing that and then doing it versus doing it because you told them to do it. Secondly, modeling from their perspective. So avoiding using you, but using things like this, it's, we, let's, I'm, from their perspective when you're talking to them. Because when you think about it, if they're going to repeat that, you want it to be what they want to say from their perspective. Or a joint perspective, because then you're just kind of avoiding all of those pronouns altogether, because those pronouns can be so hard, especially with like reversal pronouns, right? Because when we ask your kids, do you want water? And they come to you when they're thirsty, do you want water? What they're trying to tell you is, I'm thirsty. So modeling phrases like that are going to help them more in that stage 1. Following their lead, that's the way that they're naturally acquiring language, as is. So when you follow their lead, you can go into their world of play and figure out what they're trying to communicate, and then they feel more validated, and that's where you kind of see that magic happen. And increasing your intonation and emotional experiences. That is so important because that's how they pick up language to begin with. So when you use intonation and recognize, okay, this is a strong emotion, I'm excited, or oh, I'm so angry, and you use that intonation or sing-songy voice, they're going to be more likely to pick that up. For example, for some of my kids, when I know they like a certain song, like London Bridge is Falling Down, I may use that intonation within playing on the trampoline because they like that song, and I may try to change up the language or in some way use that as a strategy. Okay, so in adjusting these strategies for each of the NLA stage. So your first step when you're working in stage 1 is to investigate their current gestalt and what they're using. So making a list of what that looks like and trying to do the investigative work to figure out what they mean. That's how your models are going to go a long way. So an example I put here, kind of what I just said, even though it's less mitigable and may be more of a way to connect with your child, when you're jumping on the trampoline, up, up, and away, or London Bridge is falling down, because that connection is key. So examine your child's language and model what you think they may want to say. And then you're also trying to give them more gestalts in stage 1. So when you're modeling language, can it fit multiple contexts and activities, or does it just fit, the cars? Let's play with cars. So modeling things like, let's go get it, this is so fun, here we go, is going to fit multiple instances of language throughout their day when they're in stage 1. When they're in stage 2, you want them to be able to mix and match those phrases. So that's when you can take something like, let's go there, to make, let's go jumping, I love to jump with me. So they're a little bit less general, they can fit the different context, and they have a little bit more flexible language in stage 2 to mitigate, which means to mix and match their phrases. And then when we get into stages 3 through 6, that's when we're supporting self-generated language and grammar exploration. So all grammar rules go out the window because we're trying to help them self-generate language. And what does that look like for a kid? Not using grammar. So an example of stage 3 where I would start if we're jumping on the trampoline here would be like 2 feet, arms up, down. So different things like that. You can still use intonation, but you're trying to help them recognize single words as single unit meanings because they progress through stages 1 through 2. Does anyone have any questions or anything to say about that? Yeah, go ahead.
So I have a student who, he'll say, do you want a hug? But he means, I want a hug.
Mm-hmm.
And so what should I do for that situation when he asks that?
So do you suspect if he's in like stage 1 or stage 2 or kind of
So
no idea?
he's going through the process, like he
Yeah.
used to receive speech
Yeah.
outside of school, and so
Yeah.
right now we're going through the IEP process with
Yeah.
him, so we don't have anything in place right now.
Yeah.
So I try to use things that I use with my son to help him, like
Yeah.
sensory-wise and stuff, but like as far as like language and stuff,
Yeah.
like I really don't
Yeah.
know what to do.
So here's what I would say. So he's saying, do you want a hug? I would say, get over here, come to me. Because that would mean you're coming to him and you're giving him a hug.
Okay.
Now, if he was in stage 2, I may change that up a little bit. My first instinct would be like, I want a hug, but that may not connect,
Mm-hmm.
right? Give me a hug. But I may use a little bit more general phrase because he may just want to engage with you. For example, a lot of my kids like to be tickled. So for one of them, I was modeling let's be silly for wanting tickles because sometimes he wants tickles, but sometimes he just really wants me to come close, or sometimes he just wants my attention. So sometimes it may be a hug, but really he kind of just wants to do like a game of chase. So that's where I try to maybe model something a little more general because then I could change that up and fit what he's wanting and mitigate that. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Anyone else have anything? Okay. I'm getting low on time here. I think okay. So we kind of talked about things to avoid, not using you, and trying to be quiet more. This can be hard for myself as well, but it can be humbling to record yourself because you recognize how much you're talking and how much you maybe are bombarding the child in a well-meaning way, right? So sometimes just recognizing like, okay, they may need quiet right now, and maybe I just kind of watch and be observant of what they're doing so then I can focus on what my models and how they connect. Ditching the taught language, so trying not to use sentence scripts, trying to avoid saying I want. It can be hard, especially if that's something that you've been used to doing and probably been told by other therapists or professionals to do, right? And know better, do better, right? So trying to avoid the taught language and just naturally modeling that language rather than requiring them to say something because then you can cause frustration, anxiety, different feelings around that, and that can be dysregulating for a child. Okay, and kind of my last thing, aside from takeaway tips, is AAC. So high-tech AAC is something I specialize in, and I often, even a lot of my speaking kids will have AAC devices because it may be harder for them to break down language through the stages of NLA. So, for example, I have a 9-year-old client that I've been working for two years now, and it is harder for him to progress through the stages. So I got him an AAC device, and we set it up with his gestalts, with gestalts that we've been modeling. One, because I really wanted to carry that over to other settings. I tended to be, me and, parents tended to be the only people modeling these things for him, and trying to get buy-in was so difficult, right? And I noticed when I got him the AAC device, he had more autonomy. He had more confidence. He could say things when he was dysregulated or upset that he can't verbally say or access that language through verbal communication. So for him, that was really great to get an AAC device. And for a lot of GLPs, that can be really beneficial in naturally progressing their language because we can put recordings, videos into the device so that if they have motor planning difficulty or difficulty consistently verbally speaking, they have access to communication through an AAC device. If anyone has any questions about this, I'm happy to chat with you after, but I always recommend if you're even considering an AAC device for your child to seek out a therapist for an evaluation. a speech therapist. Okay, and just my takeaway tips of being consistent, and I think my biggest thing today would be trying to eliminate your questions at home, and trying to focus more on that declarative language modeling for your child, because questions can place a lot of pressure on the child and not provide the language models that they can then use later. Okay, I think we kind of answered questions throughout, so I'm glad.